You're now live.
We are now live, and I'll get rid of that big announcement. This is going to call this meeting to order. This is a joint meeting between the Senate Finance and the Senate Education Committee to get our initial run through on the pupil weighting study. This has been one of two really heavy duty studies that has been taken over the summer. And I want to thank Senator Hardy and Representative Kornheiser. The briefings I've gotten is they went above and beyond the standard and really went back into the history and the whys and the wherefores. So I appreciate that. One technical announcement for the live stream audience. It has been brought to our attention that the live streaming captions that many of the committees run are grossly incorrect, can sometimes bring incorrect information, and just are not overly helpful. We've also learned that the live stream, within 24 hours on the live stream, you can watch these meetings with a predominantly correct closed caption. So for now, I've talked to the committee. We are not going to be running the closed caption during the committee. However, if any member of the public would like to see that, contact me or contact our committee staff or any of the committee members, and we will get it turned on for that day. I just watched it once when it first went up, and there was something about the Abenaki Nation, and it came out as Nike, as in shoes. So was a little inaccurate and probably somewhat disrespectful. So that's my technical announcement. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Hardy. I've been asked that we hold our questions. This is an hour-long presentation, and it's just our initial presentation. If there's time at the end, we can do questions. If not, this will not be the last time we have this discussion, and we do have Senator Hardy with us every day, so we can fit some time in to ask her questions. So with that, Senator Hardy, Representative Kornheiser, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, everyone. It's good to see everybody in both committees today. Representative Kornheiser and I have a slide deck, which should be available on our website. So rather than sharing our screen, if you could all pull it up on your screen and follow along at home, literally, that would be great. We are going to sort of tag team back and forth the presentation. We gave it this morning in Ways and Means, and it is just under an hour if we stick to our notes. So we would love to be able to get through the whole thing without questions. And then, as Senator Cummings said, we can come back, or I'm here every day and you can ask me questions as we move through all the topics. So with that, Representative Kornheiser is going to get us started.
Thanks. Really nice to be here with you all, and much gratitude for the hour you're about to sit through. So thanks for your attention in advance. So the membership of the task force, as you know, was split between Finance and Ways and Means and both Senate and House Education committees. And so want to give particular thanks to Senators Brock and Perchlik and Hooker, who are all here in the room with us today, who did some fantastic work with us through the summer and fall to get this done. The task force's charge was quite broad, as you may remember, when we passed Act 59 last year. And so the big picture charge that we had was to ensure all public school students have equitable access to educational opportunities. No small feat, especially during the summer. And so what was embedded in that was the conversation around weighting calculation and the values associated with that. But that was just one piece of what we were asked to look at. We were also asked to look at categorical aid possibilities, how we measure poverty, what mathematical functions we use to calculate all of these things and apply them, education quality standards, what they mean, how we apply them, transition mechanisms for whatever our proposals are, special education in the context of Act 173 block grants. We were supposed to make sure that all of our work was consistent with Acts 60, 68, and 46, also no small bills. Tax equity considerations generally and specifically, and the excess spending threshold.
So first, I just got a text from one of you asking me, the slide deck is called the Pupil Weighting Task Force Recommendations Overview, if you're searching for it on the website. And I don't know if it's under my name, but mine or Emily's name.
Yeah, and it's right on the finance website.
It's on the finance.
Yeah, on the finance website, it is under Senator Hardy's name. I think it's about the third one down in the list.
Okay, sorry, it's not on the education website. But yeah, it should be up there on the finance website. So the task force process, we were very careful to have a very organized process because we knew we had a lot to get through. We started our work in late June and ended in mid-December. We had 12 official meetings that we were allotted, plus 2 public hearings. We were staffed by legislative operations, JFO, and AOE. And Emily and I were in touch more or less every day throughout that 6-month period. We heard from over 50 witnesses and had over 70 public comments during our public hearings and during our regular task force meetings. We started out with really trying to understand and make sure we were all up to speed with the foundational and historical understanding of the Vermont school finance system going back decades. And we tried very hard to base our policy decisions and recommendations on analysis and data, and not what we started to refer to as the printout wars, which is, you know, running a scenario for all school districts in the state, and then looking to see what happened to our school districts, and then making decisions based on that. We did not do that. We really dug into the policy and the data first before we did any kind of printouts or modeling. We kept in close communication with the Pupil Weighting Task Force report authors and had them in nearly every single meeting to testify on individual topics. We tried to approach everything with curiosity and with a desire to create the best system possible. I will note that Senator Brock often said, if we were to create a new system, how would we do it? And that's something we kept in our minds all the time. We were bipartisan, collaborative, and collegial. The 8 of us worked really, really well together, and we ended up with a comprehensive report that had unanimous approval of the final report.
So given that taxes and public schools are 2 of the most controversial and emotional topics we deal with, and we were operating in an environment of real increased stress and reactivity, sort of globally, we really thought about core values to guide our task force work. And again, thanks to Senator Brock, we're focused on really understanding what the word equity meant to each person on the task force, given that it was a word that was thrown around quite a bit in the lead up to our work and was supposed to guide so much of our work. We really focused on defining that first and had a commitment to equity for taxation and resource allocation, which are 2 quite different things and sometimes get used synonymously. That was a very hard word to get out of my mouth. We were focused on providing equitable resources to every school district in the state. We acknowledged again that we were working in a time of crisis, both for schools and students because of COVID, but also because of really sort of the increased politicization of school systems and school boards and tax decisions. We wanted to preserve the really incredible equity that's already embedded in our current school finance system. We wanted to understand and prevent unintended consequences, which is something we always strive to do, but is particularly easy in a system as complex as this. We wanted to ensure that we had appropriate accountability, evaluation, and oversight over whatever we did. And the joke that I made through this was we want to do that so that we never have to meet as a task force again. A lot of the decisions that we were sitting with were decisions that had been sort of conversations that hadn't been had comprehensively in quite a while. And we want to ensure those conversations are happening more regularly in the future. We wanted to improve the transparency and simplicity of our tax system. That is, core principles of a quality tax system, and was an important part of how we were doing our work, given that we have one of the most complex systems in the country. And whatever recommendations we had, we wanted to develop a fair and smooth transition to whatever those new mechanisms were, so that districts who might have a reduced tax capacity could manage their budgets and tax rates, as well as districts that might gain tax capacity can adequately plan how to leverage new resources. A big spike in either direction, whether positive or negative, can be incredibly disruptive to school systems that are already quite destabilized.
So now we're going to move into actually going over our recommendations that are in the report. And the report itself, I believe, should also be on our website, on the finance website, maybe also on the education website, and it's certainly on the task force website under the JFO pages. So I highly recommend it. It's excellent reading, if I do say so myself, to read the whole report. But here's an overview of our recommendations. And we started out with what we considered systemic change recommendations. And we created two options, and we'll go into some reasons why as we go through this. But option one was to actually introduce or recommend a set of pupil weights. This was the pupil weighting task force. It came from a pupil weighting report. And so we do have a recommendation for if we go with changes in pupil weights, what those weights should be. So adopting a general set of school level pupil weights, all applied using an additive mathematical function. Currently, our weights are applied using a mix of addition and multiplication, and we had a riveting conversation about the difference between what happens when you add or multiply a weight, and we determined that it was both simpler and also fairer and better mathematically to use all additive functions. And we recommended, and we'll go through the specific weights in a couple slides, weights for students living in poverty, which is a current weight, adding middle schools to the current high school weight, small weights for small schools with 100 and fewer students, and then also schools with 100 to 250 students, and then school districts in areas with low population density with cutoff points at 155 and 36 people per square mile. So really our very rural parts of the state. So those were the recommendations for pupil weighting. We also came up with a recommendation for a second option, which we call cost equity payments. And Emily will go into a bit more detail about this, but adopt a general set of cost equity payments, which are derived from the pupil weight cost equivalents. Behind each of the pupil weights, there is a cost equivalent. We also recommended conducting further analysis to determine the specific amounts and the impact on school districts, but the set of cost equity payments would cover the same set of areas of student need as the pupil weights would. So those are our two systemic change recommendations.
And then regardless which of those two paths the legislature might decide to go down, both paths lead back to the same set of further recommendations to accompany systemic options. And there are many of those, so bear with me for a moment. One is an English language learners categorical aid program to create targeted funding to benefit all schools with English language students and eliminate the pupil weight for English language learners. And each of these we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about, so don't worry about me being too brief. I won't be soon. Counting students living in poverty, changing how we measure students living in poverty from enrollment in SNAP, which is food stamp program, to free and reduced price lunch enrollment, and then moving towards a universal income declaration form that some districts are already using. We propose that we eliminate the small schools grant and use weights instead, as Senator Hardy just mentioned. And then we maintain merger support grants for districts that don't qualify for those weights. And a little shift in the merger support grants that we'll also talk about. We recommend a series of transition mechanisms for those changes, which include something like a 5-year phase-in, suspending the excess spending threshold during the transition, and consider using education fund surplus. Also recommend the creation of an education tax advisory committee to oversee updates to either the weights or the cost equity payments, and to create a consensus, essentially forecasting process between AOE and JFO to have these conversations in the future and on a regular basis. So once again, we never have to meet again as a task force. We also, and student need can be accommodated for and thought about on a very regular basis. We recommend a comprehensive evaluation mechanism to see if the changes we made improve student outcomes and equity of opportunity. And moving to a unified income-based taxation system for K-12 education funding, eliminating the homestead property taxes for education and replacing it with a unified local income tax system. We also have some more recommendations, which we're calling additional recommendations, which are pieces that sit next to this and came up and were part of our purview, but are not as deeply sort of systemically tied to the financial changes or the fiscal changes we would make with the weights or the cost equity. And those include monitoring the implementation of Act 173, special education block grants, education quality standard process and oversight, corresponding property tax credits with current year tax bills instead of past year tax bills, monitoring the Act 45 childcare financing study so that pre-K weights can be attended to, considering fractional weights for early college programs, students enrolled in early college programs, and exploring the creation of student mental health and trauma-informed instruction grants.
So this next slide lays out a table of the actual weights that we're recommending. So if you look at the table, it has what the current weight is in our current system, because we do have weights, some weights in our current system, and then our proposed weight. For those of you who've been following this issue closely, you might note that these weights are not the weights that were recommended in the original study. There are actually a number of sets of weights recommended in that study, some school level weights, some school district level weights, and then some regional weights. The weights that we're recommending are school level weights, and they are not the ones in the actual study because of some changes that we are recommending. One being the additive recommendation that I mentioned, moving from a mix of addition and multiplication to just using addition. And then the second change being the way that we measure poverty. And Representative Kornheiser will go into that a little bit more later. We've mentioned it before, but those two changes actually change the value of the weights. And once we made those two changes, we asked the report authors to rerun their same statistical analysis and come up with new weights for each of the categories. And those are the weights that are proposed by the task force. And they wrote us a memo dated October 28th, 2021 that includes these weights. It's the same empirical process and analysis that they use for the original weights to come up with these new weights that were changed because of those two factors. So you'll see that the poverty weight changes from the current 0.25 to a proposal of 1.03. There's no weight recommended for the ELL learners, and I'll go into more depth about that in a little bit. We add a middle school weight of 0.36, increase the secondary weight for high school students. It looks like it's a decrease from 1.13 to 0.039 to 0.39, but it's actually an increase because we also shift from a base of 1 to a base of 0 in calculating the weights. And so the equivalent would be 1.39, but it's actually by shifting to a base of 0 goes to 0.39. And Brad James would love to talk to you more about this. That is an increase in the secondary weight. The pre-K weight was not part of the study, and we didn't make a recommendation on that weight. There is a childcare financing study that's due out next year that hopefully will talk about the pre-K weight. There are new enrollment weights for small schools. As I said before, with small schools of 100 and fewer and 101 to 250. We did have a discussion about whether a school with 250 kids is a small school in the Vermont context. Some of us thought no, and some of us thought maybe, but you'll note that that weight is quite small. It's 0.7. And then the small schools weights are also dependent on the population density weights, which are the next 3 categories of 36 persons per square mile, 36 to 55, and 55 to 100, and those different cutoffs for those weights. And you'll note that they get smaller, the weights get smaller as the population density increases. In order to get the small schools weight, the schools have to be in an area of 55 persons per square mile or less. So those are that is the set of weights that we're recommending if we go with the route of continuing with pupil weights.
And then we have this other option, which is cost equity payments. And we have a table on the next slide that's example cost equity payment amounts. We are proposing that the exact same categories of student need are compensated for using cost equity payments as we would use with the weights. But instead of creating tax capacity and equalized pupils and all of the stuff that goes with weights that we'll talk about a little bit more, we are proposing that for every student that is counted in one of these categories in a school district, the school district would receive this dollar amount for that student as part of their budgeting process. It would come before they calculate ed spending, at the same time that they are accounting for things like federal grants and other state aid, and it would all be part of the amount of their budget that is filled out before education spending is calculated. And so a student, say, that is living in poverty and is secondary grade enrolled would count in both of those categories. And the dollars that came from these cost equity payments would be used however the district saw fit. This is not a grant program with targeted funds to a specific need. It is a way of supporting districts to account for the increased cost of certain students in developing their overall budget and tax regime. The dollar amounts in the column, the per pupil cost equity payment, are very close, we think, to what the final dollar amount will be that we propose, but they are in fact a placeholder. Deb Brighton estimated them based on a bunch of math, and I'm going to spare you at this moment, but we will share with you when and if you are ready for that really fun background, and is very close, we believe, to calculations that the UVM team is going to deliver to us in a memo any day now, which again, the cost equity payments, I'm going to back up for a second here. So the UVM study, they put a bunch of stuff into a statistical box. And what came out of the statistical box was cost equivalencies for all of these different student factors. And then they took those cost equivalencies for different student factors and they did more math and turned it into a pupil weight. And what we asked them to do for these cost equity payment amounts is they have the cost equivalency that came out of the black box of statistics. And we asked them to, instead of turning that into a pupil weight, just turn it into a cost equity payment. And that's a fairly straightforward process from them. And the only reason we don't have the memo yet is because of Christmas and all of the things that happen right before we start. So that's coming soon. And these numbers, we understand, are placeholders, but very close to what the real numbers would be. And so very helpful in doing the modeling and understanding impacts and all of those things.
So as I mentioned before, we spent the first part of our time together as a task force talking about the background on Vermont school funding system. And we saw our work as part of a continuum of improving our system, making it more equitable, making it more responsive to student needs. As you all know, the landmark decision, Brigham decision in the late 1990s, which led to Act 60 and Act 68, really started off this era of our school finance system with a strong and successful focus on taxpayer equity. And because of Brigham and Act 60 and 68, we have one of the most equitable school funding systems in the country. We also have a state education fund, which, as you know, is a statewide shared fund with multiple revenue sources. And that is essentially self-balancing based on the school budgets that are proposed and passed at the local level, and also our work in the legislature in setting the yield and the tax rates. We have strong local control of school spending decisions. School boards and local voters determine school district budgets. We do not. We also have currently a combination of pupil weights, which create equalized pupils, and categorical aid, which are targeted funding to address specific student needs. The most significant categorical aid currently is special education funding. Our system is a combination of complexity and collectivity, which both enhances equity, but also creates confusion, and also means that any changes deliver ripple effects across the entire system. So a decision that one school district makes in their budget has a ripple effect across every school district and every taxpayer in the state, as does any changes in the pupil weights or any changes in categorical aid or cost equity payments. It impacts every single district because of our shared collective system. There were also a number of other significant pieces of legislation since Act 60 and 68 that have impacted school equity and opportunities for our students. The one that is most well known is Act 46, which changed the governance of our school districts and also improved equity across many of our school districts. There were also expansion of educational opportunities through initiatives including universal pre-K, curricular pathways, and special education changes.
So one key aspect of that school funding system that we sat with a lot in our work is this idea that pupil weights shift school district tax capacity, not school district spending or resource allocation, because of how we calculate tax capacity in our schools, in our school system, and because of the local control that is, absolutely intrinsic to the way we understand public education in Vermont. And you all know that those pieces are like a key tension in the systems that we work with. But it meant that we started asking the question a month probably into our work, which was essentially, are weights the appropriate mechanism for creating equity in our current finance system? Weights are used across the country to deliver equitable resources to districts, but they're used in a completely different system than the system that we have. And so in this system that is so dependent on these ideas around tax capacity and local control, do weights actually create the equitable funding streams that we would need to create equitable education opportunities for our kids?
So we created a sort of list of pros and cons for each of the two approaches. And I was a little hesitant to put them into two boxes of pros and cons, because it really does in some ways depend on your perspectives on what is a pro and what is a con. But I went ahead and did it anyway, and we did it for both of them. So knowing that your list may be a little bit different, or everybody's list may be a little bit different, the pupil weighting approach, which is our current approach, and these pros and cons already exist within our current system. The pros of continuing with the weighting system is that it is the current system. It maintains the current system and is a familiar framework. It's familiar to us. It's familiar to local school districts and their budgeting process. So it wouldn't be changing our system. It is dynamic to differential budget needs and of local school districts. So local school districts, as we've heard many times, and as we know, especially those of us who've put together a school district budget, every district has slightly different needs, and the weights sort of help balance those needs in a lot of ways. It's easier to adjust for inflation. You don't have to build in an inflationary adjustment to weights. And it maintains local control of spending decisions and priorities, which given that that is such an inherent thing in the history of school finance in Vermont, is a pro. It maintains that sort of part of our culture. A con is that it does not guarantee that additional funds will be approved by voters or spent on the area of need. If the whole point is that some students need extra resources in order to have the same outcomes, which is what the goal of the whole pupil weighting study is, there's no guarantee that that will happen with weights, because local schools still determine the budget and voters still need to approve the budget. So the extra resources may not actually be spent on the students who are weighted in the formula. It has a magnifying impact when you apply the weights, benefiting higher spending school districts more than lower spending districts. Differential weights for areas of needs means that the larger weights actually offset the impact of the smaller weights. So because the poverty weight is the largest weight, it offsets the impact of the small schools weights and the grade level weights and the rurality or sparsity weights. And so that the needs sort of cancel each other out in some ways. Equalized pupil calculations are confusing to voters. Heck, they're confusing to us sometimes. So it's not necessarily an obvious thing. What is an equalized pupil? And it may increase overall education spending. The increase in the weights may increase overall education spending.
Many of the drawbacks of the weights are true now under current law. It's just that the weights are so small right now that the distortions that they cause in the system are not something that we need to attend to in the same way the distortions that they might cause in our education finance system would be if we created, if we implemented these heavier, larger weights. And so, and many of the pros and cons of both cost equity and pupil weights are the same. But there are some pros to the cost equity payment approach that I'd like to talk through. One, it delivers payments directly to districts that reflect the per pupil cost for different categories of need. And so this idea of one need canceling each other out is resolved in some ways, because for every student need identified, there's a specific payment that's delivered to correspond with that need. And so we have identified it, we've said it is true, and then we are attending to it. It still maintains the ability for districts to spend additional funding as desired. It simplifies the formula by totally eliminating the equalized pupil calculation, which I think is just so exciting. And then we just talk about average daily membership, which is almost like just talking about kids. It's very close, the number of kids to the average daily membership number. And so voters can understand that better, it can be talked about more easily. It creates a much more transparent and accountable system, both in terms of how we count per pupil spending becomes much more transparent and accountable to districts, and how districts construct their budgets becomes much more transparent and accountable. And what we are actually delivering from the state coffers to from the ed fund to districts also becomes much more transparent and accountable. There are some challenges though. So both the cost equity and the pupil weighting have very, very similar trends in terms of the tax impact that they'll have on districts. Districts that tend to experience a loss or a reduction in tax capacity in pupil weighting tend to also experience a reduction in tax capacity under cost equity. But under cost equity, those changes are a little bit spikier. And if you want to see the spikier versus the less spikier graphs, you can find those in the appendix of the report. And if you can't find them in the appendix of the report, just ask one of us and we'll point you to the right page number. There are a lot of unknown unknowns about cost equity. It's one of the reasons that we recommend two paths and not just this one, because it's a new idea and there's a lot more that needs to be worked through, more modeling to be done, more questions to be asked. It's a new idea. It is not sensitive to the different local budget needs or marginal costs of a district. It does not benefit higher spending districts more than lower spending districts, and some people see that as a challenge. It needs either in regular inflation adjustments or regular recalibration. The pupil weights also require regular recalibration, but they don't require inflation adjustments. And like the weights, both of these scenarios may increase overall spending on education in our state. And in this scenario, there is hope that we could minimize the administrative burden on districts with timely information from the Agency of Education and the tax commissioner.
So the next slide, we move into our recommendations that go with these two options. And the first one, and one that we spent an enormous amount of time on and was difficult for the task force, and we struggled with it, was what to do with English language learning, English language learners. And what we ultimately decided was to recommend that we create a targeted categorical aid in order to meet the needs of this group of students. English language learners there are a growing number of them in our school districts, and there are a growing number of school districts that have students who need English language learning services. There's currently a concentration in just a few districts, 10 districts, mostly in Chittenden County, one in Washington County, with a large number of students. The largest one being the Burlington School District with over 500 students who need English language learning services. And there's a growing number of districts with a small number of students. So 1, 2, 5 students who might need ELL services. And there's a real differential in the type of program and the type of services that are offered to students in the districts with a lot of ELL students and districts with a small number of ELL students. But they all are required to provide the same services and are struggling to do so. The pupil weight calculation, and one of the things that sort of tipped us off early is that the report talks about, the original report talks about how the pupil weight calculation for the ELL weight is less consistent than the other weights. Because of this concentration of ELL students with most of them in 10 districts and really most of them in 1 and 2 districts, the weight was less statistically accurate than the other weights. And the report authors actually struggled with what to recommend and ultimately said maybe a regional weight would be better. And so we picked up on this pretty early and started to look at other options for ELL students. There's a huge variation across the state on the amount of money per pupil that districts spend on ELL students, and also the level of services and opportunities that districts provide. And as we've talked about, the weights do not ensure that additional funding is actually spent on an area of need. An ELL weight would not guarantee that the money is spent on ELL services and students, but a categorical aid targeted to ELL services does make that guarantee. There's identifiable costs for this type of program. Districts can figure out how much they spend on ELL teachers, on translators, on support systems, on outreach, on family support for this very defined program. And they do so already for the federal requirements for ELL education. There's a desire for accountability to ensure that sufficient funds are spent on ELL students, regardless of district location, program size, or number of ELL students. ELL students, in most cases, are a protected class of students, and we want to make sure that we are able to provide adequate and sufficient educational opportunities to these students, regardless of where they go to school. It is, I should note, important to identify an accurate and adequate amount of a per pupil grant for ELL education. In the report, we have what is really a placeholder proposal, which will provide $25,000 per school district for every school district that has at least one ELL student, plus a $5,000 per pupil amount per student. And this would get every district at least $30,000 to hire a part-time student teacher to teach, even if they have only one ELL student. And we derive that based on looking at budgets that current school districts use for ELL students, and also comparing what other states provide as additional resources for ELL students. But we are, as Emily mentioned, waiting for a memo from the report authors where we ask them for a recommendation for a categorical aid amount for ELL. And there are other sources of information we can use to derive an accurate and adequate amount. By having a targeted categorical aid grant program, it ensures a statewide commitment to equitable education for all of our ELL students, regardless of where they go to school. And this includes immigrants, guest workers, and refugees. And as you all know, we are welcoming new refugees to our state as we speak. And we want to make sure that regardless of where they settle, they have an equitable education. And having a statewide categorical aid avoids difficult local decisions about race, culture, and immigration status when determining school budgets. We've seen this happen in our state, and we want to avoid it and show a statewide commitment to educational equity for ELL students.
I need to stop muting myself. We are now on the 16th slide on our journey together today. I am about to talk about changes to how we measure poverty. This is one of my favorite details of this for some reason. And essentially, right now, we measure poverty for the purposes of pupil weighting, and really only for the purposes of pupil weighting. This is the only, I think, time in all of the various ways we measure poverty in the state that we use this measure of poverty as the number of families in the school system that are enrolled in food stamp programs, SNAP benefits. We are recommending that we move to using free and reduced price lunch enrollment, because that is an available data point that is available throughout the state, because we report it to the feds right now for their measurement of poverty. However, we know that that is still not an entirely accurate measure of poverty for a few reasons that I will talk about in a second. So we would like to, while we are using free and reduced lunch as a stand-in, as a better measure, begin the process to moving to a universal income declaration form. There are a few districts in the state that already use universal income declaration forms. Burlington is one of them, Brattleboro is one of them, I believe Montpelier is another one of them. Districts that have universal lunch programs at this point are using universal income declaration forms, and we would like to extend that to the whole state. We want to do that for a few reasons. SNAP enrollment is the least accurate of these three measures of poverty, because enrollment in SNAP benefits is a process that is both rife with shame. It has a lot of geographic disparity, because folks in rural areas have both a harder time getting to an economic services office to enroll, and have a harder time with internet access to enroll. And folks at the margins, folks who are just barely eligible for SNAP, often won't bother with the pretty extensive process of enrolling. And so we lose all of those folks who are sort of counted at the edge. Free and reduced price lunch is a more accurate measure, because you get rid of some of that geographic disparity and some of that edge, but you still have a lot of shame and stigma attached to it. And you, as more and more districts move to universal lunch programs, there's less and less of an incentive for folks to sign up or fill out the free and reduced lunch paperwork. However, if everyone in the state is using a simplified universal income declaration form, we are asked, that means that all families in a school would be filling out that paperwork, which removes a lot of the shame and stigma from doing the paperwork. And under federal law, we're allowed to require districts to collect, and districts are allowed to require parents to fill out the paperwork, whereas we are not allowed to require free and reduced lunch paperwork of families.
The next slide is about, oh, go Emily.
Right, last piece on this is that both free and reduced lunch numbers and universal income declaration numbers can be controlled and facilitated by the school district, and so they can be responsible for their own counting. SNAP benefits is something that's outside of the district's control because it is done by DCF. And so it's hard for districts to understand why their numbers might be what they are. Back to you, Ruth. Sorry about that.
No problem. I'm just conscious of the time. So
Indeed.
small schools grants and merger support grants, we recommend replacing the small school grants, eliminating them, which they seem to be universally despised. So hopefully everybody's happy about that. And instead creating a weight or a cost equity payment for small schools. And as I went over earlier, schools with fewer than 100 students and then 100 to 250 schools. These schools must be in a school district where the population density is less than 55 people per square mile. So it would not include schools in, downtown Burlington or even in Middlebury or Montpelier, but really rural areas of the state with low population density. And the weights would only apply to the pupils that are attending the actual small schools. So the school that has 80 kids in it, those 80 kids would get counted, not the 500 kids that go to the high school. It would only be for the small school. We would maintain merger support grants, and these would be for districts that merged either through a community vote or merged through State Board of Education order under Act 46. And those merger support grants would be maintained because those were previously small schools grants that were created, that were changed into merger support grants. But districts that qualify for the small school weight would not maintain their merger support grants. And there are some of those districts that would qualify for both. So they would get the weight, not the merger support grant. Otherwise, they would. You're muted, Emily.
Thanks. I thought you cut out at the end, so I was still waiting for the rest of your sentence. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Transition mechanisms. We are on slide 18. So the task force's top concern was ensuring that districts don't experience serious disruption during this extremely difficult and stressful time. But we also know that it's the most strategic time to act because federal funds are flowing to schools and the education fund has a significant surplus that could be used to lower tax rates through this transition time. Both paths, weights and cost equity, have similar impacts on district tax rates. Those that gain tax capacity in one model gain tax capacity in the other. Whether the legislature adopts weights or a cost equity model, implementation must be gradual and deliberate. And due to our statewide self-balancing ed fund, in order for tax rates to stay constant, districts can only increase their spending at the same speed that another district essentially adjusts down. And so as we are doing modeling on this, as we come to final recommendations, we are thinking about a 5-year timeline for implementation, but really want to put a target around a 5% maximum change in rates as we sort of look at how many years this adjustment would take place so that we don't disrupt spending. We also recommend that we suspend the excess spending threshold and the hold harmless provisions during the transition period while making clear what those would look like at the end of the transition period so folks can plan for it. We would like to transition the property tax credit to current year to further cushion impacts and mitigate impacts. We would like to pay attention through this process to statewide spending on education because changes could be a cost driver. And burying the lead, move to a fully income-based education tax system in our state. I shuffled around the slides, Ruth, in between this last presentation and this one, and you all have a different slide deck than I'm looking at. So I'm jumping 2 slides ahead and you're just going to bear with me. Sorry, I don't even know if I told you that, Senator Hardy. The next slide is income tax for education funding because it seems like it belongs here better. And essentially, we are proposing something which we are certainly not the first folks to think of. It was in the recent Tax Structure Commission report. I believe you have a bill on the wall of your committee already on moving to an income-based education funding system. But essentially, 70% of Vermonters qualify for a property tax credit due to their income. And therefore, they already pay education taxes based on income, and 30% of Vermonters are now paying on their homestead based on their primary residences. And we are recommending that everyone moves to an income-based calculation for their education taxes. We believe that doing this in conjunction with the move around pupil weights or a cost equity formula allows us to both account for those folks who might be lower income or middle income folks, sort of on the edge of middle income folks who might live in a higher spending district or a district that feels comfortable voting in higher budgets, but those individuals might not necessarily be able to afford it themselves. And that example, I think, is a perfect place to think about how, by moving to this system, we can move beyond a lot of the rhetoric of winning towns and losing towns that have dominated much of this conversation up until now, and think about each person paying their share of educating all of Vermont's kids.
So now we're on the slide of education quality standards and accountability. You did surprise me, Emily. I was like, wait, where is she? We did look at a number of issues that will most likely be taken up by our education committee. So it's great that Senator Campion and his committee are here. This is one of those issues about education quality standards and accountability. We really wanted to make sure that as we're improving equity, hopefully, we're also ensuring that all Vermont students receive a high quality education. And one way to do this is through our education quality standard system, and making sure that we have a continuously verified formal oversight process and measurable education quality standards. This is something that the AOE currently has. It has been a bumpy few years trying to make sure that that process is working, and AOE and the State Board of Education are currently working together on modifications on who has oversight of this system. We want to make sure that we provide AOE with the positions and resources necessary to support this work and to support school districts in maintaining and verifying education quality. Right now, we're not convinced that they have adequate resources necessary to do it. And this is ongoing work of the AOE, the State Board of Education, school districts, obviously, and also our education committees. Special education block grant is a similar area that we hope that our education committees will work on. In 2018, Act 173 was passed. It actually created the pupil weighting study, not the task force, but the original study. It created a reimbursement census block grant system for special education, as well as funding flexibility and significant professional development and best practice expectations for special ed. It's been delayed twice by the legislature, once because of AOE readiness to do it, and the second time because of COVID. There was an analysis in the pupil weighting factors report about possible changes to these block grants based on potential links between poverty and demand for special education services. But the report also cautions that this conclusion, it may not be necessary because of causal evidence, not due to a lack of causal evidence and likely sufficient aid amounts. So we're just recommending that our education committees take a look at this issue and follow the transition of Act 173. Finally, program review. And this is something that Senator Brock, kudos to him for bringing this up many, many times to make sure did all of this work and any changes that we make accomplish the desired outcome. So we need to, from the beginning, build in an evaluation mechanism and decide whether and to the extent which each of the goals of equity, simplicity, and accountability, and any other goals that we might determine have been met. And also, how should these goals be measured? One of the concerns I personally have and others have with the pupil weighting factors report is that it's actually based on a single outcome. And that single outcome is standardized test scores, which in and of themselves are problematic. So how should we measure more broadly equity and outcomes? And if the goal has not been met, what is the reason for the failure, and what recommendations do we make to achieve that goal? And what is the fiscal impact of the legislation and the cost of implementing those goals?
So there were also some other issues for further review that were very clearly very close and impacted the cost of education and the and school budgets in Vermont, but we're sort of outside of our purview, but we want to name them because they really are significant drivers and challenges for school budgets. And those include the pre-kindergarten weight, which is likely inadequate, but was outside of our purview of pursuing and needs to be part of the childcare financing study. Tuitioning and how that works and how those numbers are calculated and how all of the money flows. And the State Board of Education is, I understand, working on that right now. And so we didn't want to get ahead of their work. School facilities construction, as I'm sure everyone knows, there's a report pending on that is going to have some pretty significant implications. Early college and potentially CTE are also areas of incentives and disincentives for student enrollment and school funding. And student mental health and trauma is likely a driver of a lot of the poverty weight and possibly the English language learning weight. That's according to the pupil weighting study. And so are there other ways we might want to address those costs in our schools in addition to either weights or cost equity payments?
So the last slide is conclusion and next steps. There's clearly more legislative analysis and on both the updated weights recommendation and most especially on the cost equity payment option, if that's a direction we decide to go in. There's additional analysis from the original report authors that is pending, as we've mentioned. And there is also our other education finance experts that we can turn to for additional information and updated opinions from another perspective. They're updating modeling for all school districts and new modeling for individual taxpayers. The data is now available to be able to do the taxpayer analysis, and we're excited to take a look at that. We can divide the components of these recommendations into the 4 committees of jurisdiction. Most of the individual recommendations can proceed separately, so we don't have to do this all as one big package. We have to monitor the work of other study groups and childcare and facilities and the implementation of new programs like the Special Education Block Grant. Overall, we need to ensure AOE has sufficient resources to support schools in critical areas. We mentioned in the education quality standards, but also in ELL, that's an area where school districts have increasing needs and AOE does not have sufficient resources to address those needs. We need to improve equity outside of our school system too. School districts get burdened with trying to make up for a lot of areas in societies, and a lot of the costs of those inequities are borne by school districts. So we want to make sure that students have adequate housing, healthcare, and social programs outside of our school districts so that when they come to school, they're ready to learn and there's not such a burden on our school districts. And overall, we need to be conscious of the impact of changes on the total cost of education, K-12 education in Vermont. We are one of the highest spending states per pupil in the country. And while many of us may think that's a good thing, it's also an area that we need to watch and be concerned with. And finally, we have to be aware of the fatigue and stress on schools and school personnel and students and families due to the pandemic. All of us who have children in the school system right now know the tremendous amount of stress and anxiety and fatigue that our schools and students are feeling right now. And any of our work that adds to that burden is just really hard right now. So we have to be conscious of that moving forward. Emily, do you want to say anything at the end? Okay. So that concludes our report. We did it in just about an hour. So hopefully that gives you a good basis for the work. And as Senator Cummings said, I will be here every day, as will Senator Brock and then Senator Perchlik and Senator Hooker in the Education Committee. And hopefully we can all work together to move pieces of this forward. Thanks.
Again, thank you. That was just an awful lot to digest. Senator Campion.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I also just want to echo what I hoping you've heard from many corners, and that is just all of you that were on that committee, but particular recognition to the two chairs. What an incredible lift it was during the summer, during a difficult time, and what a well-written, well-articulated product you produced. So thank you so much, as well as thank you for your continued work in helping us as we navigate where to start each part, which you didn't sign up for the continuation, but I think we appreciate your willingness to do so. So thank you.
We are going.
My
Okay.
pleasure.
So thank you. Senator Bray.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the great report. I'm going to be reading the print version more carefully. It's going to take me a while to take all that in. And but I did have one of the things you mentioned up front was how important it was to have a shared definition of equity. And so I don't want to take too long, but I'm wondering if you can, what consensus definition did you land on so that we kind of know the lens that you ended up bringing to that question?
Do you want me to take that, Emily, or do you want to give it a shot?
I kind of want to give it a shot, but you can if you want, Senator Hardy.
We didn't, Senator Bray, I saw your text to me during the presentation, but we didn't actually land on a consensus definition of what equity is. We did have a lot of conversations about equity and how a lot of how equity is really based in the fact that you can't, equity and equality are different, and that if you treat every student the same, then that is not equity. And so therefore, recognizing that some students have higher needs than other students and that those needs have additional costs to them creates a more equitable system. And that's what we were trying to do, is understand and recognize the differential needs of different types of students and different types of schools, because it's not all about students, it's about where the schools are located or the size of the schools, and that those schools may need differential attention and costs or weights added to them. So we had a lot of conversations. I don't think that we didn't embed in the report anywhere our singular definition of equity, and but we did have a lot of interesting conversations about it, including visual conversations about it. And Emily, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Yeah, I would just add that we, rather than coming to consensus, I think we became discerning with the use of the word. And so that student equity is different from taxpayer equity, which is different from tax rate equity, which is different from spending equity, which is different from district equity. And that we became much more careful about being clear about which version of equity we were each talking about or we were using in the report, because I think they all get used interchangeably. And it's being discerning about which area of the education system you're talking about when talking about equity. And with that and the arrival, I think, of your CLA conversation, I'm gonna, I think, go home to my committee and be available for further questions. Is that okay for you,
I think that's fine. Our next slate of witnesses is here.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
We will say goodbye. Thank you for joining us. Thank everyone for their hard work.
Senator, we're meeting at 3. We're hearing from the Agency of Education and Agency of Department of Health. So a little time to get ready. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great to see everybody, most of you. Not you, Pearson.
Okay.
Wow.
So let's see who we've got left with us. Okay, we are going on to our first kind of endeavor into the education fund. And I have Commissioner Bolio on. So Commissioner, I don't know if I have no pride in authorship. I don't think Faith does in the way witnesses are laid out. So if you'd rather go some other way or I'm thinking maybe Graham go first, but I will leave that up to you. You are first on my agenda.
Graham, do you have strong opinions about me going first or after y'all?
I have very strong opinions about you going first, Craig. I'm just kidding.
Okay, then we'll
It's-
stick with the agenda.
why don't you go first, Craig? Because
Yep.
the letters your thing. And
Sure.
yeah.
You're also the most color coordinated. Your outfit and your room
I
are
appreciate
totally
that.
dialed in there.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
What?
Oh,
Um,
Pearson's room clashes. Oh, but his
No,
tie
it
matches his
it
room.
matches
All
that too.
right.
we're doing all right. Well, thank you all.
Okay.
Let's,
We're devolving. It's time we've just had an hour on the waiting study. So I think the committee is releasing a little steam. It's going to be a heavy afternoon.
well, let's jump into something easy with yields and the education
Yes.
fund. It's good to see all of you. I thought about stealing Senator Campion's joke and saying it's good to see all of you except you, Pearson, but I have no reason to do that. My name is Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner. I am here with Jake Feldman as well today, our Senior Fiscal Analyst, and we're going to walk through the December 1 letter that was published last month and some of what that letter says. And then I'm also going to speak a little bit about what the governor has proposed to do with some of the surplus that we'll talk about. So I'll start with a little background. The December 1 letter is a statutory requirement for the Commissioner of Taxes, myself, to publish by December 1st of each year and use the best information that we have at the time to forecast property yield, income yield, and the corresponding homestead and non-homestead tax rates. And many of the parameters that go into the calculation are also prescribed in statute. So the property yield represents the amount of per pupil spending that would result in a $1 homestead tax rate, and the income yield represents the amount of per pupil spending that would result in a family paying 2% of their household income towards property taxes. And then the non-homestead rate applies to any property that is not declared as a homestead, which is owner-occupied primary residences. And those homestead declarations come through an annual filing to my department. And so, that means that things like second homes, camps, apartments, commercial buildings, industrial, all of that falls into the non-homestead category. And I'm sure this committee is very aware that was changed a few years ago away from non-residential because much of that property is still used for residential use, and also because much of it, I think more than half of it, is owned by Vermonters. And then I always like to just keep in mind in my own head that the homestead property taxes comprise about a quarter of ed fund sources. Other major sources are the non-homestead portion of property taxes, which are forecasted to be about 40% in fiscal year 23. And then sales tax is another huge chunk of that, which is projected to be about 30% in fiscal year 23. And my headline for my testimony today is that I have signed 3 of these letters now, and I can say without hesitation that this one is my favorite. The last 2 that I signed the prior 2 years, I'm sure this committee remembers, had very stormy skies ahead. And this year we do not have stormy skies ahead. In fact, we have significant surplus, which is a much more fortunate position to be in. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's jump into what this year's the letter said. So the big wild card is the nearly $90 million of surplus that's projected for fiscal year 23. May get even larger after the emergency board meeting that's coming up. And there's a few main elements that are comprising that. About a little less than half of the surplus is due to better than forecasted performance in some of those non-property tax revenues. So sales tax, 20%, 25% of meals and rooms tax goes into the ed fund. You'll remember that as we were forecasting, or as the economists were forecasting in the pandemic, there was a lot of worry about those revenues seeing a precipitous decline due to disruption, economic disruption from the pandemic. And fortunately, those forecasts did not bear out. So we have more money than we thought from that. With a similar story, another 11 million of that surplus was because property tax credits cost less than forecast. Again, a very similar story. The worry was that economic disruption due to the pandemic would result in lower incomes, and that did not materialize to the degree forecasted. And then there were some additional surpluses from fiscal year 21 and other reversions that comprise the rest of it. But once you put it all together, you have a really unprecedented $90 million surplus. And an important element for the letter and for the work that my department does is that the law requires the department to consider all of that surplus to reducing or buying down the rates. And so that's why, as you're looking at the letter, you see two different scenarios. So scenario A is calculating the yields and rates as if the full 90 million is going towards buying down the rates as prescribed in statute. And we also presented a scenario B, which was that none of that money is used to buy down the rates, and it's used for, you know, a variety of other purposes that are up to the legislature. As you look at what the actual forecasts shook out at, in scenario A, with the full rate buy down, it's forecasting a 21.5 cent reduction in the average equalized homestead rate, and a nearly 23-cent reduction in the non-homestead rate. Now, these rates are before CLAs are applied, which I'll talk about in a second, and is an important consideration. But the other element that we forecast is what will actually happen to property tax bills, right? Because the rates are just one element of that puzzle. And so in scenario A, the letter is forecasting a 9% decrease to average property tax bills. And really, to just think about how fortunate that is compared to past letters, you may remember that my letter last year forecasted an average increase of 9%. So this is a complete 180, and again, a much better position to be in. Scenario B, where no money is used to buy down the rates, we are still forecasting a 2.5% decrease to average property tax bills. And the reason for that, even though there's a projected increase in education spending, is because in the current fiscal year, the Ed Fund essentially collected $90 million too much. And so because spending is not projected to increase by more than that, the forecast is that when you add in all of the other increases to the non-property tax revenues, we are still expecting a property tax bill decrease, even with none of the one-time money applied to the rates. And I think the last thing I'll say before I speak about what the governor's proposal is, you know, the average rate is just one of the pieces of a property tax bill. And one of the other ones that we are talking about a lot this year and is critically important is the common level of appraisal, the CLA. And so the CLA, as I'm sure this committee is very familiar with, is a mechanism to help ensure that there are uniform property values around the state, that everybody is essentially pegged towards fair market value to help ensure that each town is sending their fair share to the education fund. And because we've seen such a boom in the Vermont real estate market this year, many communities, many more than normal, are seeing substantial drops in their CLA. And as a CLA goes down, it means that sale prices in those towns are getting further and further away from the grand list values. The sale prices are higher, that is, which drives the CLA down and thereby drives the actual rate in that town up. So while the headline of the letter says, you know, 21.5 cent average homestead rate decline, most communities around the state are not going to see such a large drop in the rate because of the way the CLA interacts with that. And so we always encourage folks to be mindful about how those interplay. The governor did lay out two different proposals on what to do with the surplus in the letter. And you heard directly from him yesterday about what his priorities are going into this session. Workforce, affordability, and education, chief among them. And so the governor is proposing to take half of the surplus, roughly 45 million, and return that to taxpayers. Now, the classic way that has been done is through a rate buy down, but actually the governor is interested in working with the legislature and stakeholders to consider a way to do an actual rebate to taxpayers. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the surplus is much higher than it normally is. So this is more material to actually get money back into the hands of folks as opposed to just have it buy down rates in the subsequent year. But also, again, because of the size of the surplus, this committee is very aware that when you use one-time money to buy down the rates, it can automatically create extra pressure in the subsequent fiscal year where you might see a rate spike if that level of one-time money is not available. So the governor's hope is that instead of doing a rate buy down, that we would do a rebate and let the rates naturally go where they would, which will help prevent that spike in the subsequent fiscal year. I do have to say my team has been spending some time thinking about ways that we could do that. And certainly the tax department can play a critical role in that, but we do believe that it would require partnership of some variety with the town. So I'm really here to start that conversation today. And if the legislature is interested, we would want to, speak with stakeholders with VLCT and the Clerks and Treasurers Association to see what resources would be needed for the towns. We don't have all of the pieces of the information that we would need to successfully do that at the department, but we believe that combining the resources that we do have at the department with the resources that are available in towns, that we could be successful with that. And the second half of the surplus, the governor is proposing to use for strategic one-time investments that will enhance workforce development programs. And one example that he laid out in the letter was additional enhancements to CTE centers. I do have to say that if the committee is interested in hearing more details about ways to spend the other half of the surplus, I would defer to my colleagues at AOE, who will have much more expertise on where to spend that money and where those needs are. So I've said a lot. I'm going to shut up and happy to take any questions. Jake, if I missed anything critical, I please ask you to correct the record, and I'll stop there.
Okay, Senator McDonald, I see your hand. Senator, you're muted.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The reason that the tax commissioner and the commissioner of education and the secretary of administration have consulted with one another in order to publish the letter of December 1st was because years ago, the administrations used to spend all the money before we showed up. So before we start to talk about how the money would be spent, could we learn who the winners and losers are compared to last year, based on the changes that have taken place in property values, in raised income, which has, what's the percentage of citizens that pay based on income now, how many may have been bumped off that schedule because of their earning more, how many, could we understand those changes before we begin to discuss spending ed fund money? Could we get a analysis of how many people pay, how many families paid their school taxes on their house and 2 acres based on their household income last year? How many are predicted to be eligible to pay for them this year, and perhaps even 2 years ago, so we can see what's going on in these economic times. Thank you.
Okay, that will be, I think we're going to be looking for a lot of background information before making any decisions. So we'll see where that goes. Any other questions, Senator Bray?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Commissioner, I guess I'm wondering if we, I'm not proposing this, but if all the money were used to buy down the rate, does that also save the state significant money in terms of making the towns whole?
I'm not sure I fully follow the question, Senator.
I don't either.
I'm sorry, could you repeat it?
Well, if the total amount owed is less, then and people are paying based on for the 70% paying based on income, for this to bring the payment back to towns up to the full amount as though they were paying full property tax. Does that end up saving the state money as you reduce the rate?
Well, I mean, you would have to raise less in the education fund through property taxes. Jake, I saw you unmute yourself. You want to take a stab at it?
I think I understand the question. It's a good puzzle, a good ed fund puzzle. So Senator Bray, if in FY23 that $90 million was used to lower the rates, what would happen is that in FY24, the cost of education property tax credits would be lower than it otherwise would be. That's what I think would happen.
Yeah. Okay.
So everyone would benefit in FY23, but in FY24, people's credits would be lower too, I believe.
Right. Well, so I'll keep that on the table as one of those education fund puzzles, but thank you.
Okay, Senator Pearson.
Thank you. Commissioner, I'm wondering if you can help me understand the proposal to invest half of the surplus in particular, you mentioned tech centers. It's always tricky for Montpelier to direct these kinds of investments because they're sort of controlled locally. So just help me understand, is this kind of off the top of the ed fund, or what's the mechanics for getting those priorities across the finish line in your proposal?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's for one-time investments. I wish I could give you more details on where that proposal is coming from, but I would really defer to my colleagues at Agency of Education, who I think can speak with this with much more expertise than I can about, ways that they see effective utilization for this. Apologies that I don't have more info today.
It's okay. It's
Yeah. There is a school facilities study out there, and we've heard some needs. We know either we're going to come up with some funding for Burlington High School, or the annual payments of their bonding is going to be paid for by everybody. So there is some school repair construction issues out there that we haven't funded in well over a decade. And I think that's something, if we've got some money, we're probably going to be looking at. We also have 2 proposals to switch to an income base, which would topsy-turvy all of this. But we are going to be looking at that too this year. So it's going to be an interesting year. Any other questions for Commissioner Bolio? Okay, Jake, do you have anything to add? Did your boss miss anything?
No, I think you got it. I think, Madam Chair, as you're aware, hot real estate market that we spoke to Ways and Means about this morning is driving CLAs down in a lot of communities. And I guess since I'm here, I'd like to just say that, towns tend to panic when their CLAs go down. They think that it's going to drive their rates up and it's a really bad thing, but the ed fund is looking pretty good this year. And the improvement in the real estate market is so widespread that I would ask that towns do the math and including the yields that are forecast to see what the impact of their spending will be. And the lower CLA is not going to be that bad this year.
And we're still doing the 3-year rolling average, right? Bringing it up. Because I also know what goes up in real estate will come down. And usually as quickly as it went up. So when this one is going to peak and drop, we don't know, but it'll be rare if it doesn't.
That's right. We used 3 years of sales for the equalization study. The most recent year of sales is the COVID year, April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. And it was, the hot year where people
Yes.
were spending much more for properties than they're listed for in the grand list.
Yes. Okay. Other questions at this point? Okay.
Madam Chair. Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator McDonald.
Before we begin to discuss how this, on these revenues to the ed fund are spent, are we gonna have enough, when are we gonna learn who are the winners and losers in the state today as a result of the various purchases that have the sales tax revenues and personal income, out-of-state land, home buyers, in-state home buyers, who are the winners and losers
Right.
during the last 12 months before we start dividing up the spoils?
We are going to learn everything that it's possible to learn before making any decisions. I'm not sure who has that information or if it's been compiled. I think probably property valuation is the place to check in, and you might, we can drop them a note and ask them to come in and talk to us about the CLA and how it's hitting different towns. If you can get down to who's a real Vermonter and who isn't, I don't know that we
No, I'm
go
not-
that
that-
granular
that's
or
fine.
how you define it, but I think anyone that sold property,
But those people,
Senator,
there are
you're
those
giving a bad
promoters
name to broadband
pay-
in Montpelier because you keep freezing.
I'm not in Montpelier, I'm in the
Ah,
hinterlands.
now, okay, that's why you're freezing.
Yeah.
You're in the rural areas.
Yes.
Okay,
We started out with an 80% of Vermonters roughly paid based on their income.
yes,
In the 2000s, that number shrank to the high 60s, and then we restored the 80%.
right,
It has fluctuated in the last decade through the recession of 2008. How many Vermonters would pay, how many Vermont households would pay based on income today for the next tax period? 80% of households, 50% of households, 70%? Do we have a number before we learn how many people
mhm,
would be eligible and how the sales and the et cetera and incomes have changed that may have thrown people off the ability to pay on income or may have brought more people on to pay based on income before
Okay.
we start to spend the money?
yes. We will find all of that out
Excellent, thank
before
you.
we
Excellent, thank you.
start to spend any money.
Madam Chair,
Okay.
one thing I might recommend, so Jill Remick, our
Yes.
Director of PVR, and Jake did a great presentation this morning on just an overview of the CLA. So it's not getting quite to the granularity that you're speaking about there, Senator McDonald, but could be a great way to start the conversation this year.
I think we're definitely going to be looking at CLA as we go forward. And its impact and on whom. Pen right now. Okay. Okay. So Graham, if there's no more questions for the commissioner or Jake, Graham, I've got Julia Richter next, and then you, and then Chris Roop. But I'm not sure that, this is up to you who you want to have go first. If you've got this planned or what's happening. It's your dog and pony show.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Graham Campbell for the record. I am going to cede the floor to Julia to take the committee through the Education Fund Outlook. I'll be available for questions that Julia cannot answer. Chris Roop, we suggested him to come in that there are questions about teachers' pensions and how it might affect the Ed Fund. I can answer those questions to a great extent, just not necessarily about the intricacies of the pension. So if there are questions about pensions, I can take those. It'll be mostly Julie and I, but Julie will be taking the committee through the Ed Fund Outlook.
Okay.
And
we get into the weeds, but I would just soon not do that since pension negotiations are still ongoing. So I think we can say theoretically what will happen, but my understanding is nothing has been signed yet. Close, but not yet. So I think any specifics we probably should stay out of at this point. So Julia, welcome. It's your baptism of fire.
Hi, thank you so much. Julia Richter for the record. And I appreciate you folks having me here today. I was thinking that first it would be helpful to go through a brief review of the Ed Fund Outlook and the rates that were set last year, and then to go through this year's December 1 Outlook and considerations. Does that sound good to the committee?
That's fine.
Okay, so just getting right into it, I don't know if you folks have had a chance to pull up the Ed Fund Outlook. It is posted on the committee webpage, but I'll just be going through it line by line.
Okay, did you send this to Faith?
Yes, it should be available in the documents.
Be on our documents and handouts, right?
Exactly.
Yes, it is. Okay.
All right.
There it is.
Everyone ready for me to get started?
I think so.
Okay. So I'm just going to start out with a brief review. So looking here at lines A through H, these are sort of the reference lines when looking at the Ed Fund Outlook. So they include the tax rates and the yields, as you can see in, A through E.
I can't see them, Madam Chair. So are they going to be posted up here so we can see them?
They are on, if you get on the page, the legislative page for finance, and go to documents, they're listed under the documents for today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. I'll keep going,
Keep
but
going.
give a holler if I should pause. So we've got A through H. These are our reference lines, and then the middle column, FY22. This is the current year. So this shows the rates and the yields that were set at the end of last session. Then we have the next sort of section, which is sources. This is lines 1 through 9, and this is the amount that's coming into the Ed Fund. So it's important to note that the property tax rates are modeled to fill in what is needed after the other sources are counted. And you'll see here, line 10 is an estimate for the upcoming fiscal year in the most right column. So this will be more precise post town meeting when schools have voted on their budgets. And then we also have lines for categorical aid put in here and spelled out. And then lines 10 through 20, this is the amount that's flowing out of the Ed Fund. So, oh, sorry, I think I misspoke. I think I got ahead of myself. So lines 1 through 9, this is the sources, and then lines 10 through 20, this is the amount flowing out of the Ed Fund. So there is line 10. which is the line I was referencing. Sorry about that. And then moving right along, we have lines 21 through 30. So this is essentially calculating the amount that's on the bottom line. So we have revenue surpluses and deficits, prior year reversions, which is still to be updated with the Budget Adjustment Act for this year, this coming year, the Stabilization Reserve, and the additional reserve, as you can see in line 30. And this is the 14 million that was earmarked for other post-employment benefits that was set aside at the end of the session last year.
That's right. The Senate did put those into the ed fund. The House couldn't reach that conclusion, but they put that money in as a reserve to pay the increase. Okay.
So this remains a consideration as to exactly how this 14 million will be allocated. And I'll touch on that a little bit in several minutes. But just wrapping up this Ed Fund outlook here, we have lines 31 and 32, and this is the amount available. So you can see in the middle column on line 32, the 89.5 million that Commissioner Bolio was talking about. And this is the surplus. So as mentioned by Commissioner Bolio, this was in part because of high revenues that overperformed what was initially expected. So this is that's a brief overview of just what we have here on the Ed Fund outlook. And now moving into the FY23 forecast year, you'll see in the rightmost column. So Commissioner Bolio already mentioned this, but as prescribed by statute, the December 1 letter must apply all the money on the bottom line. So that's the 89.5 million to reduce tax bills. And this explains why the forecasted rates that you see here in lines A through C and 1 through 2, it explains why they're lower than last year's rates because this 89.5 million has been applied. And I want to note that this only needs to be done for the December 1 letter. And it doesn't mean that this is how the money must be spent. So
we
on
know that.
Okay. I just didn't
think
want
we ever
to
go by the letter.
All right. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yes, no, that's helpful.
And so on average, this is about a 22-cent decrease from last year's rates. And as I'm sure the committee also knows, that the December 1 letter models the bills to change in proportion to last year's bills, meaning that they all rise by the same proportion or fall by the same proportion. And so this column is obviously a forecast, and it will be updated through the coming weeks and months. So the first update will be in mid-January. The lines that will likely be updated includes lines 3 through 6, which are source lines, and these will come with Tom Cavet's updated forecast that comes January 13th, as well as the prior year reversions that can be seen in line 22 with the Budget Adjustment Act.
Okay. I guess what interests me as we go through this, and we've already seen the governor's proposal to spend or how to accommodate the 89 or 90 million, what's just rounded out, is sales tax makes up a significant portion of this tax of the additional funds, their major source. And we know that there were significant federal stimulus checks that went to, I think, almost every Vermonter. And between that and the Wayfair decision, there was a sudden, rapid increase in sales, even though most of our downtown businesses were closed or only open partially. What I'm trying to before I start spending, one of the things I want to know is, it doesn't look like those stimulus are going to be coming in again. Some of the data we got, because a year and a half ago, we were looking at have $150 million deficit in the ed fund. So, this is culture shock. Is how much of that is sustainable? I mean, if people did, and the indication was they did, buy durable goods, washers, dryers, big screen TVs, they're probably not going to go out and spend that kind of money again. Maybe on cars, because you can't get cars right now, at least not new cars. But how much of this how much of this money, if we did nothing, would still be there a year or 2 years from now, so that we don't cause a culture shock by decreasing it how many cents this year and then having to blow it back up in 2 years? And the other question is, does any of this include, and do we know what's happening with the ESSER funds that went to schools? And is that impacting school spending at all? And that's probably a Department of Ed question.
Yeah, so 2 great questions. I will start off with the second one because I think it's the shorter answer.
Yeah, it's probably more in yours.
My understanding is that with regards to the ESSER funds, that AOE is putting together a slide deck within the next week or so regarding the status of different funding streams.
Okay.
With regards to education. So
Okay.
So we can follow up with that when that comes forward. With regards to the exact amounts of ESSER funds that have been spent by which schools and in which areas, I personally can't speak to that at this moment.
Okay.
And then I guess with respect to your first question, it's a great question. I'm not sure if one of my other colleagues has an idea from, if you're talking about this surplus on the bottom line, the 89.5 million,
Mhm.
that is really up for discussion as to how it should be used. So it could be
Right.
used in one-time appropriations. It could be used to lower tax rates in a single year over a couple of years. It could be reserved for future years. So that is a very flexible sum
Right.
of money. As for the future development of these different tax sources, I'm not sure. I don't know if someone else has an idea.
I think part of the problem is we put the sales tax in just maybe 6 months before the Wayfair decision, and then the pandemic hit, and then the stimulus hit. So we didn't have a sustained amount of time to see what the sales tax revenue, over a normal period, what the sales tax revenue would be on average. So we don't know, but we know we've got all this extra money. And if it's sustainable money, if we think in 2 years, it's going to be with us, then you spend it one way. If you think, half of it's not going to be with us in 2 years, then you may want to spend that half the other way. The governor seems, he's spending it all. He's doing half in tax rate. So he seems to think half is going to be with us in 2 or 3 years. And the other half he's suggesting we do as one time. And that, so I think that's his take on it. I'm not sure where, what his background is, but I think
Madam
that's
Chair,
Yes, Graham.
I'm hoping to jump in just to provide some assistance on this. So with respect to the non-property tax revenues within the education fund, you're correct that the general fund transfer was repealed and the education fund received 100% of the sales and use tax and the meals and rooms tax. And shortly thereafter, there was the Wayfair decision, and then we passed the marketplace facilitator law, which boosted sales taxes. And then also the pandemic, despite what we initially thought, has been a boon for consumption tax revenues almost across the board. The current July 2021 forecast, builds in this bump related to increased goods spending. And so what you see is a bump in fiscal years 22 and 23. And then you kind of see a leveling off in the future of about 2 to 3% growth thereafter. So I guess what I would say about these revenues is that I would not expect gangbusters growth going forward, but it is a sort of level shift up in revenues. After speaking with Tom Cavett about these revenues overall, the way he sort of described it as there's a lot of fiscal stimulus and federal largesse that's floating around in the economy right now. And a lot of excess savings is being held by individuals. And as that money sort of starts to drain out, we can expect to sort of see the growth in these revenue sources sort of slow down just a little bit. But I would not characterize it as a situation where we're going to see a pop and then a come back down. It's more of a pop and a slow growth thereafter.
Okay, so he thinks it's going to stay at it's going to stay at this level and grow more slowly, which is good because the CLA, the other factor in this is the housing market and housing values, and those historically have gone up and frequently come down lower than where they started to go up. So and it's been pretty rapid.
Right. And I think to the long-term question for this committee and the legislature in general is how fast do the appropriations within the ed fund grow relative to the growth in the non-property tax education sources. So for instance, if education spending grows at 4 or 5% a year, but the total sales and use tax, purchase and use tax, meals and rooms tax grow at 3, then that delta is going to be borne by the property tax. And so we generally don't, or I'm not sure if the Agency of Education makes out year projections of education spending and categorical aid beyond the upcoming fiscal year. So I can't give a definitive answer, but I think insofar as there is a difference in those two, then you're going to see more weight being put onto the property tax.
Okay. And then we have the weighting study, which will have cost to some, but it's been suggested we phase that in. And then we have pensions, which depending on how they play out, we know, I think I'm remembering my numbers correctly, we did take a $30 million hit last year on the just the underestimating the return on investment. And it was 6 and it's now 36 million. So it started from a low base. And is it 9 million that was in for teachers' health care when the Senate put it in?
When the Senate passed its version of the yield last year, you all put the normal cost of teachers OPEB into the ed fund, and it was about 13.8 million.
It was 13.
The House did not include that in there. Right. And then at conference, what what the agreement was to essentially set aside 14 million as a reserve. So rather than putting it
Okay.
into as a line item for appropriations within the ed fund, it's sort of sitting there as
Right.
it's in its own special reserve of sorts.
I remember now the total of around 43, which if it wasn't for all this excess revenue, would have been a major issue, and it just kind of slid under the radar because there was just revenue to cover it. But it is a major increase in expense. And Chris, I see you've popped on, but I'm assuming that by the time we get finished with pensions, there's going to be some increased cost to hit the ed fund.
Yeah, Madam Chair, if I may, Chris Troop, Joint Fiscal Office. My colleague Graham nailed the explanation and nailed the numbers. What that cost that you're referring to last year is the increased normal cost for the teacher pension system.
Right.
And the reason why that normal cost went up so much from year to year is that the demographic and economic assumptions changed pretty significantly. So the assumed rate of return dropped from 7.5 to 7%. That led to some pretty sizable increases. Those increases are going to sort of remain at those higher levels in a status quo situation. So according to the latest valuations, the total teacher pension normal cost for FY23 will be 42.1 million. So some of that will be offset by some of the contributions we get from LEAs from their federally funded staff. But generally, you expect that normal cost for the pension to stay pretty consistent as a percentage of payroll, and payroll is expected to grow at about 3% a year. So you generally expect those costs to go up a little bit every year. And the normal cost for the OPEB, for the subsidized healthcare, was $13.8 million last year. The latest valuation has that normal cost now at 15.1. So again, these costs are expected to sort of grow as in dollar figures because they're specifically meant to track payroll growth. But in future years, I know the Treasurer's Office has taken some pretty significant steps to reform some of the healthcare delivery package on the teacher OPEB side. So I expect you'll see that normal cost start to come down a little bit in the future.
Okay. Senator McDonald, are you raising your hand or is?
Madam Chair, we made predictions last year that haven't come anywhere close to what we expected, and predictions that we make here today are about as likely to come close. And the Appropriations Committee for years has sought to get off the business of providing increases based on cost of living to the ed fund every year. And they succeeded. And they now have the sales tax is where we get our revenues. But last year, we also had added in to the ed fund to pay for were some teachers' pensions. So some of that money's been used already. Graham was talking earlier about how if there's a shortfall, then it falls on the property tax. And that's the term we use. But it doesn't fall on the property tax for 80% of Vermonters who pay school taxes based on their income.
Right.
So before we talk about where money may or may not go, can we find out how many people pay based on income, how many new out-of-state purchasers are now going to be who bought houses here, and whether we're going to allot them the same reduction that we allow Vermont residents who've been buying all this stuff to fill up the ed fund. I'm sure they don't expect to have their sales tax monies collected, then not be able to pay based on income, and have to pick up non-residential homeowners' tax bills. This is a dedicated fund. It takes a notwithstanding the law to take the money out. And we should, before we start discussing how we might take the money out of this dedicated fund that pays for schools, we ought to find out what the status is for the various parties that
Yeah.
benefit. And
We
I've
will
said this 3
find
times, which means
that
that
out.
probably board people ears, but we have new folks on staff who are working like crazy to update themselves and become familiar. And they're talking about appropriating money from the ed fund.
No,
for
no,
things
I
that
don't
are not ed fund
The only,
appropriated.
Senator, the only one that's talked about appropriating money is the governor. And I don't think I heard him talk about appropriating it away from education. Either we're going to put aside money to rebuild Burlington High School, or it is going to get paid for by every property taxpayer in the state. That's the system we've set up, and that's the discussion we're going to have. But I haven't heard anyone talk about taking money, unless I misheard, taking money out of the ed fund and using it to benefit anyone other than property taxpayers of all kinds.
Or people who pay based on income.
Well, we can always adjust that too, Senator. We've done that. We also are going to look at having everybody pay on income. And we don't know
I
what that
apologize,
one will
Madam
look.
Chair. I'm overwrought because when we begin to use terms like appropriation and property tax, when we mean tax on income, and I will stop and we'll cooler
Okay,
heads will prevail. Thank you.
thank you. We're not, okay, Senator Pearson.
Well, Madam Chair, I would just offer to Senator McDonald that every year on day 1 and 2 and 5, the governor in particular comes in with some ideas and says, this is what we're going to do. And the legislature doesn't say thank you and pass the law. We do our due diligence. So I hear you saying the details that would be required for us to consider those proposals. And I think they're on the mark. But I don't hear anyone actually saying this is a serious proposal that we're considering. It is coming from the administration. So to the extent that you're worried that we're not taking into consideration the many pieces of it, that doesn't make sense to me. This is day 1 here, and so keep helping us understand what we need to understand before we move any of that forward. But I wouldn't get so dejected that we haven't taken it into consideration, because we've just barely learned about it an hour ago.
You're just learning. And this is a very unusual year, as the last 2 have been. I mean, going from $150 million deficit to a $90 million surplus, I think is unprecedented. And I think we're trying to find the prudent way to move that surplus, and as best we can, trying to predict the future of the fund and trying to decide what is, what's the best thing to do with $90 million. And I think it was, Julia that laid it out. We can, as we have in the past with much smaller surpluses, use some of it to level out future increases, just an increase in school budgets. We can use it to help level out some of the impact and maybe move the weighting study forward a little faster. We can use some of it to deal with some of the needs that schools have for basic health and safety, which we have not helped with. And, we'll see where it goes. I think I'm trying to think of where I would get. I think we will ask the Department of Education or maybe property valuation to give us an answer as to what's the percentage of Vermonters that are paid based on their income. But we're also going to have to start doing some calculations as to what would it mean, what would it look like if everybody paid based on their income. And then I hope that was Senator McDonald's computer that tipped over and not Senator McDonald. We've got a lot to go through. Usually it's that we don't have enough money. This year we've got too much. It's a good place to be, but start thinking of information you want and get it to me or get it to Faith. Daddy, you think you need to walk us through this. Senator Sorokin, welcome back.
Thank
You
you.
missed a wonderful presentation on the waiting study, and now we're trying to decide how we spend the $90 million surplus in the ed fund. It's an unusual year.
Unanticipated revenues.
Unanticipated revenue, yes. So anyway, committee thoughts at this point. Senator Hardy.
I just want to say that in the pupil weighting study presentation and also in the report itself, we note that it's about 70% of Vermont taxpayers that pay the homestead tax based on income. And I believe we got that number from JFO. So Graham, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the number we cited. It's about 70%. And there is the JFO and their consultant, Deb Braden, is working on modeling the income tax proposal for shifting to all income. And my understanding, I have not seen it yet, Senator McDonald, but my understanding is that it would divvy out by types of taxpayer groups. So we could see more granular data, and Graham might know more than I do.
I'm surprised that didn't get done as part of the tax commission study, which recommended the same thing.
The reason that it didn't is because the tax commission was not able to get that data. And Emily's not here to take credit for this, but the pupil weighting task force, we were able to finally get the data. Jake is still on the screen from
Thank
Jake
you.
and the tax department. So it was about the access to data, and it was requested multiple times and finally was able to. It was a huge work for Jake and his team to put it together, but it was a lot about the availability of data. So we were able to get that data from the tax department last fall. And my understanding is that Deb is either working on it or has recently completed that analysis. So we should certainly have her in here to go through it.
I think my plan, if I'm remembering, next week, we've got 3 bills now on cannabis and the cannabis people. So we're going to spend a broadband day and a cannabis day at least next week. And then we've got 3 sections. The income tax on the tax report, the tax commission report, is the big one. The other 2 were fairly minimal. So I'm going to try and get those fit in next week, so we at least know what those proposals are and why, and see what kind of numbers back them up. We're also trying to get a hold of Michael Costa, who was the director of the original tax study, and see if he would be willing, now that it's Zoom, maybe he can find an hour from his present job to talk to us about that study and their thinking and the recommendations. My memory, and I'm not sure who else was here, Senator McDonald, was that study was put together to look at our position. Every time a tax study came out, they looked at the top marginal tax rate, and Vermont was a terrible place to be, because I think California had the only top tax rate higher than ours. It didn't ever say, well, you only paid that on, it was 300 and something, but the money above that $300 threshold, that everything else was paid on the lower rates. Other states had much lower rates, but they started them at $20,000 or $30,000, and Massachusetts had a flat rate. So there, I stand to be corrected, but I believe they were put together to look at our tax code and figure out if we could, in fact, position ourselves so we always didn't look like the most tax unfriendly state in the country, which is not the charge we gave the last commission. But they did come in with a few things, and I think it would be good to talk to them or talk to Michael, who wrote it. I don't know that we could round everybody up at this point. And we will get, I know there's a minority report, Senator Brock, and we will get that. There were 2 reports, and we'll trace those down and get them up on our website so you can read them, or we'll have Faith send them to you. But that's, I think, where we're going. We just started doing, we did our work on the agenda for next week, but those are the 2 big areas. I'm hoping that it looks like we've got the taxes and fees coming to us from the Cannabis Commission, and then it looks like there's 2 or 3 proposals. I have a feeling one bill is probably reflecting the will of the commission. Senator Pearson, you may know that better than I do. And then we got a second one today. So one is titled State Colleges. So we're going to have a couple of different proposals, and we'll probably come up with a few more on how to spend the money. But it probably will be easier and less complex than a lot of except that we don't have hard money at this point. It's projection. But that I'm trying to get that out of the way. We're going to look at Rygate. I'm trying to get some of the simple little bills out of the way so that we can, we're going to really be doing a lot of work in both broadband and in property tax this year. It looks, we've just got multiple things that are going to impact and influence the property tax. And so I want to make sure we have time to do due diligence to all of that. I think going to income-based for everybody will be probably the first really major change since we did Act 60, if we go there. And I've also, after Tom Cavett next week, I've asked if Joint Fiscal can give us an update on our future revenue projections, because Tom also does, a tentative 5-year projection. I'm trying to get a handle, I think I said yesterday, on what our ongoing projections for revenue are as opposed to our ongoing needs. We had a bill, it's an H bills passed the House, that's starting with asking the Secretary of Human Services to get a report every year on the cost of delivering community-based services, that your mental health, home health, choices for care, anything that is not covered under our Medicaid waiver, so that when we set the reimbursement rates, we at least know what the costs are. And that begs the question of where are we going to get the revenue? Because I think we all know, one of the witnesses this morning said our human base is imploding. I mean, it's just disintegrating, both in workforce and, the ability to attract has a fair amount to do with the ability to pay. So I want to make sure that we're looking at the big picture and not doing things in tunnel vision, and then 2 years from now find out maybe we can do it all. But I want to make sure that we look at it all before we make a decision, because all we need is more money to fix a lot of the problems. So we will see where this goes. You probably don't know yet, but I'd be interested to see what kind of returns we're getting, income tax returns, and it's too early, I think, from all of the remote workers that we surmise were here during the pandemic. I'm assuming, Graham, that it's too early. Maybe a few of them have filed, but
perhaps too early. My conversations with Tom Gavette and also with the tax department are do not expect to get a ton of information about remote workers and the extent to which people have moved up to Vermont. There's just not a lot of information on a tax return to indicate that. I mean, for instance, we could look at the number of new filers have showed up in tax year 20 and 21, but that doesn't necessarily indicate that they, moved here from another state. They could have just not filed in a given year. So they're
the first year out of college.
Yeah, exactly. Or a separated spouse, for instance.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly quite clear. I think the best evidence that we have about new people moving into Vermont is within the property transfer tax data, and that seems to be. It's showing significant value growth and the value of transactions, both at the commercial and the non-residential and residential level, but also where where the growth in property tax transfer revenue is coming from, probably transfer tax revenue is coming from. I think Tom Cavett forecast in is it July or January last year showed significant increases in the value and volume of sales in the more tourist parts of the state, so ski towns, areas like Woodstock, Manchester, etc. And so that seems to be indicative of out-of-state people moving in. The only other thing I've seen related to the influx of new people into the state is the census just released new estimates of people moving in and out of states for calendar year 20, and Vermont gained about 4,400 new people. So not necessarily taxpayers, but people, which is a huge number in a single year for a small state like Vermont.
Of course, the question is, how many of them will be here next year. My relative who spent last year here with her young children, she and her husband working remotely, is now back in Boston. Still owns property here, but is not living here this year unless maybe she's decided to make a move. But her kids were going to school in Boston remotely. And that's where we're doing it. The estimate I got is the property values went up 54% in 6 months in Montpelier. And we aren't a vacation town. And some of us are paying capital gains on that. The question is, how many people are going to be paying some income tax to Vermont because they were here, working here remotely? How many are going to stay once it's safe to go home? And I guess, that's something that's just going to have to play out over the next couple of years. But probably shouldn't spend all the money right away. And the market is due for a correction. Okay. Any other questions, committee? Anything else? So we need to find out, probably have property taxation and review come in and talk to us about the CLA, where they see it going up, where they see it going down, if anywhere, how it's distributed. And the Times Argus, so I assume the Rutland Herald actually had, was it yesterday, was the day before, an editorial on movements the census was showing, which has always been an issue, is who's moving in, who's moving out. How rich are they? How poor are they? But I don't know where the governor got his statistics, and are the workers we're losing moving out, or the workers we're losing just not working for a variety of reasons, including they can't get childcare, or their kids are in and out of school, and all kinds of things that have disrupted the normal flow in the last year. So anything else you'd like included? Any information? If you think of anything, let me know. And we'll see what we can do. We'll get Deb Brighton in as soon as we can. I know she's still trying to retire. So we better get her in before she does. Because I think she's been trying for several years. She's still working with our new folks to help them get a handle on what she's been doing for us for years. So,
I think Julia has been working with her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Julia's there. Yeah.
Because I've been able to have a lot of good trainings with Deb, and she's trying to update me on the model and understand all of the modeling aspects. So I'm working on getting there. It's definitely a lot to learn. But Deb is a good teacher. So hopefully I can get there soon.
Yeah. Download her brain, and then
yes,
then she can retire.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, because, Deb has been doing analysis and modeling, which we never saw. What she models ends up in our spreadsheet. And, this was all the behind the scenes activity that very seldom, if ever, comes to our attention. And so if nothing else, I think the retirements we've had in joint fiscal is helping us understand that it's a lot more complex than Mark showing up with his spreadsheet and just saying, well, these are how the numbers have changed since last year, that it's a much more complex, like weighting, which was just something that always happened. So we've got a lot. If that flight plan that I saw, Senator Hardy, that you sent out for the weighting study, we are going to be looking at the section on income-based. But I think the last one, the second one we got, which was developing a transition and tax rates and stuff, is really going to have to wait till the end, until everybody else finishes and we know what it is, before we can start. We can start, but before we can do any finalizing on numbers for.
Well, it was more than that. You and I should talk about it.
Yeah, we will. I just read it over and said, well, just trying to figure out what I need to start on now.
The bulk of it actually is on this committee. So yeah, but we should have.
Committee doesn't need any more bulk.
I know. We should talk and obviously speak.
Okay, you and I will talk and figure out a game plan for that, because I think we all know the last couple weeks we tend to be inundated and you don't do your best work at that point. So yeah, let's see how quickly at least we can set up some of the background that you did, so we're starting on a level playing field. And
yeah, absolutely. Whenever, just let me know when you're available and we can chat about it.
Oh, available.
Yeah, I know. The weekend.
I think it noon tomorrow. I got 15 minutes off today. I think at noon tomorrow we can talk. I literally, that's the one day of the week I have noon free, or any evening. I'm here. Actually, this evening I'm here. My husband's got a meeting, so on Zoom. So yeah, if you want to give me a call anytime, we'll talk, or we'll get it set up. Okay. Okay. Well, committee, thank you. Don't get used to going home this early. And I will see you tomorrow. We've got a couple of just
The only
things
thing
that,
I wanted to say was Senator Pearson looks really great in that outfit in that room. It's really dialed it in.
It's too late.
Garrett Pearson's tie. Where is his cat? We have not seen any cats this year.
Good.
Just like the
Are you
computer
ready to
office.
end
Seen a
live?
few babies, but we haven't seen any cats.